Probiotics matter. How do you know if you've got a good one? In this One Belly Wednesday, we'll talk about infant formulation probiotics, the children's formulation, and the adult formulations we carry, plus a couple special considerations for probiotics in this primer for people who are just entering the field in that wild west of probiotics market that's out there. So I've been partnering with Claire Labs for well over a decade now, and the reason that I partner with them is because of two big reasons. Number one, there is research evidence for every single thing that they put inside and in their formulations. Reason number two, they are very conscious about doing their own studies on stability. I live in Florida. I practice in Florida. A lot of their stuff has to get shipped across the country. And so I was really concerned about what I saw when I saw these bottles on a shelf with probiotics in other grocery stores. And then I saw some in the refrigerator. And I was wondering, well, should I be refrigerating ours? Claire Labs actually did a study on this to figure out whether or not they needed their probiotics to be refrigerated. And they came up with some pretty interesting data. So I want to get to that in a little bit. But first, let me help you understand what probiotics are and why kids should have them. First off, probiotics are what we call like the good bacteria. They are on the inside and outsides of our bodies in massive numbers. These good beneficial bacteria range somewhere like on a 7-to-1 relationship with the kinds of cells that are your own cells. 7 times the number of stars in the Milky Way galaxy. That's how many trillions of cells that aren't yours, that don't share your DNA, 27 trillion, are what we kind of put the microbiome at. And so it's really, really amazing to me to think that people get really skeezed out about bacteria and viruses when statistically speaking, you've got way more beneficial bacteria in and on you than would ever be floating through the air to land on you and make you sick. So it really helps me understand the difference between a proactive approach to health and a reactive approach to health. So when we're talking about that proactive approach, we also have to be aware that people have hand sanitized the living dickens out of everything. We have all kinds of chemicals on shopping carts, all kinds of chemicals on surfaces, even sprayed on your food for your own benefit. And that includes bleaching your own chicken. So if you have questions about, well, I should be eating really healthy and clean, well, whether you do or not has actually nothing to do with you. A lot of it has to do with the surfaces that you touch on a daily basis and whether or not someone decided to spray that with some kind of disinfectant before you walked in the door. My basic point here is that we're constantly under assault in a way we've never been before. And so the antidote for that is a regular supply. I used to be a big proponent of saying, oh, you know what, eat your fermented vegetables, eat your fermented foods. That should keep you in good balance. Really kind of now where it's at is bring those into your diet on a regular basis. You should be consuming things like kefir and kombucha and sauerkraut and kimchi and all that kind of thing. But on a regular basis, it's probably a really smart idea to also supplement not only you, but your children as well. And so that gets me into what kind of formularies we're looking for infants up to 3, and then from 3-year-olds up till about puberty, and then from puberty onwards. And then again, I mentioned some special topics. So most bacteria that you're going to find in a good quality probiotic are in the bifidobacteria and lactobacillus categories. And those friends are there in numbers that should range around 15 billion. 10 to 15 billion is kind of the estimated study that Claire Labs did when they were looking at the guts of vaginally born breastfed babies. They kind of looked through their microbiome, looked through their poop, and figured out what was supposed to be in there. And so they came up with about 10 different species, mostly lactobacillus and bifidobacteria that ought to be in there. And in their dosage originally is about a quarter teaspoon of a dose was 10 to 15 billion bacteria. Along came the FDA a few years ago and said, well, you got to be really careful about giving probiotics to babies. And so Claire responded by adding in a little scooper. It's an eighth of a scoop, eighth of a teaspoon is a scoop. And so it kind of cut my usual recommendation in half. I started off with that for 0 to 3 months. But generally by that point in time, I'm encouraging most people up to a quarter. Now, if we've got babies who are constipated, like my son Charlie, or if he had some kind of gastric upset, like that chunky spit up, that post-digested reflux, we were doubling that up for him. So he was doing about 2 scoops twice a day. I have some babies who aren't pooping. Like gold standard for poop for me in a day is 2 to 5 bowel movements every single day. Breast milk isn't this magical thing that comes into a baby's body and suddenly the body uses all of it because it's so pure and perfect. We should be making poop. Input and output ought to be equal. And so if we aren't, then that's a signal we've got some kind of dysbiosis, some kind of bad balance usually in the gut, or the gut's trying really hard to break something down and can't quite do it. That's pretty common too. So if that's the case, then for those babies, again, I'm kicking those probiotic dosage recommendations up somewhere like a quarter teaspoon in a bottle, maybe once, twice, sometimes 3 times a day until we get that bowel regulated to the 2 to 5 gold standard. Once we hit about 3 years old, so those kids now are somewhere around, closer to 20 billion colony forming units in the servings that they've been getting through the powdered formulation, we start switching into children's chewables. And those are around 25 billion colony forming units. A little bit different in the numbers, like the amounts and the species from the infant formulation, because these kids are up and moving. They're putting all kinds of things in their mouth. My son Forrest is a classic example of this. He is a big mouther. We're just in the grocery store. He's 5 and a half this weekend, and he was just taking the outside things of the bread and just squishing everything with his hands. I'm like, Forrest, stop touching everything, right? But kids do that. They get their hands in on things. He's, you know, putting his mouth on seats. I have no idea why kids do this kind of stuff. I do, right? It's a whole sensory thing he's going through with the window, but it blows your mind as a parent that you're like, this is not making sense to me. Would you please stop doing this? Those kids usually, those probiotics, that's going to be different, right? They even say things like the family dog have some kind of like good beneficial bacteria when they're licking your kid's face, which is kind of weird to think about, but kids who grow up with dogs actually do have less allergies. So those children will usually maintain a chewable dose of those 25 billion colony forming units for somewhere up until the time that they're 12 to 14 years old. So then this big surge happens, puberty happens. We've got a whole new set of endocrine things going on. In the pyramid, I always talk about the nerve system, the hormone or endocrine system, the immune system, and the gut, the microbiome. As one of those pieces starts to shift, the rest has to adapt to. And so the Therabiotic Complete is generally Claire's gold standard for what they usually recommend. They've been doing, for that, they package it so that at expiration, those little capsules will have about 35 billion colony forming units in them. It usually means that they're packed with somewhere closer to 45 billion. And by the time they hit expiration, the little bacteria on the insides have eaten up the food enough that they're now going to be considered expired once they drop below the 35 billion mark. So if you have ever traveled with these, you'll notice that if your suitcase gets hot, those little critters start eating their food a little bit faster. And so the capsules will start turning brown on the inside. I've noticed when I've taken those, still, they ended up getting some gas with that. Those were super active little critters. And so I don't know, it caused me a little discomfort. I wouldn't necessarily do that. I would look to keep them refrigerated. That's what I do at home. But generally what Claire will do, and this is the study that they did several years ago, is that they recommend that you do refrigerate them once they go home, but they are shelf stable, meaning that if you keep your house somewhere between 72 and 76 degrees, somewhere south of 80 degrees, then those bacteria will last inside that jar for about 6 months. Now, if you look really carefully at the dosage on there, a bottle should last you about 2 months. I will tell you here at Mama's Chiropractic, we can't keep a bottle in stock for longer than 4 weeks. We turn over our inventory like crazy, especially with the baby formulations. We're buying new bottles of that, and we're buying close to 24 of bottles at a pop. And we fly through those things usually within 4 to 8 weeks. So by the time that you're looking at an expiration of those bacteria, if you hit that point, it meant that you weren't taking your probiotics. So we can keep them shelf stable because we keep all of our offices at a climate controlled environment. Those things are sitting out of the sun. So I've never really been worried about the quality for what we're selling. I will tell you though, that something that Claire did recently made me super duper happy, which was that they started carrying a different adult formulation. They call it Symbiotic. And Symbiotic is a companion. It's what I've looked for a very long time. There are these concepts of things called prebiotics, which are different kinds of food and structures that the good bacteria inside your gut like to eat. And they change up the gut bacteria just a little bit so that your body has the benefit of a broader spectrum to work with. It's the thing that we've seen in the literature for a very long time, that generally speaking, broader is better when it comes to gut flora. So I really didn't like the idea that I was creating monocultures inside of people. It's why I kept on recommending things like go eat your ferments, go make sure you drink them, because it was bringing in different species, even though some of them are yeast. I'm not a big fan of that sometimes for some people with things like Candida. I was still trying to push them in a direction that would change it up a little bit, encouraging people to experiment. Well, now I've got Symbiotic. And Symbiotic, again, has a completely different profile for the bacteria in there. It's strong. It's one capsule. You take it for about 30 days. And you'll notice that when you do that changeover from therabiotic, the adult formulation, to the symbiotic, your belly has a little bit of a party for a couple days as the body does a little bit of turnover in there. That's a healthy thing. And then usually people will get back on the therabiotic, and that one lasts 2 months. So we're basically cycling a new kind of species in there about every 3 months or so. I'm really, really happy about that. Now, some considerations. I mentioned mostly the lactobacillus and the bifidobacteria families. There's kind of an old way of classifying bacteria in terms of how the immune system will respond to it as being a cell-mediated conversation inside the body or a humoral or like antibody response within the body. A lot of people are talking about antibodies for whatever reason right now. But when we're talking about the kind of immune system response that you want, one of the things, one of the reasons that bacteria like probiotics work is because it keeps a healthy immune system conversation going inside of your system. It speaks the language of long-term immunity through cellular chemical messengers called cytokines. And those cytokines are really, really important. Now, you can get yourself over talking in that direction, especially people who have autoimmune related issues. So those people generally have a cell mediated immunity that's gone a little wacky. It's going after their own cells and it's having too much of that conversation. It's kind of like a close talker, right? You're like, yeah, back off, slow down. I don't need all this like being dumped on me. So what we generally will find is if those people are taking a general probiotic that has a lot of lactobacillus or bifidobacteria, or hey, look, maybe they're eating at a frozen yogurt stand and they're saying, well, man, my belly really feels bad after I do that. The reason for that is that it's really shifting their body too far in that conversation towards autoimmunity. And what we want is actually a different kind of conversation. There's a probiotic that's called Saccharomyces boulardii. And Saccharomyces we carry for those people who seem to be really sensitive to normal probiotics. It's a much smaller dose. It actually got its name and notoriety for helping with traveler's diarrhea. It was my lifesaver when I went through about a salmonella poisoning. But Saccharomyces is a really handy thing for us to have in that special kind of consideration. One other very special consideration that we carry. So there's a therabiotic complete that I refer to as the big dog. And that therabiotic complete comes as a powder, and their quarter teaspoon dose for the powder is actually 100 billion colony forming units. This is serious stuff. And so those jars, we don't carry very many of them because I don't need it very often, but there's a couple instances where I usually recommend it. I happen to have several children in my office who are on feeding tubes. And so they have a lot of bowel issues. And when they get constipated, they aren't verbal. And so we have a hard time figuring out what's going on besides, oh, wait, when was the last time so-and-so had a bowel movement? So what we'll do is we'll use that therabiotic complete, like the big one, and put that into their food for their bolus. And so what that does is that really helps them rebuild their guts in a way that they couldn't get otherwise. Claire's actually built some of their notoriety on helping children like that. Children who are on the autism spectrum disorder, children who have bariatric surgeries, those kinds of things, really helping them rebuild their guts through their therabiotic formulation. Second thing that we'll usually do is that if we have moms who have experienced some kind of antibiotic use during their pregnancy, close to the end of their third term, is that we'll have her on the big therabiotic complete as either a rinse for her body or as an internal or as something that she can take orally to help her rebuild her flora. So that includes things like if she's gone through a course of treatment for group B positive strep. And so if she has those kinds of issues, we usually put her on the big dog formulation. Also, if we're trying to crowd out something, so if we've got some kind of other infection going on in the body, infestations of things like candida, that really big therabiotic complete can also be super helpful at helping to clear that out. We're talking with our nursing moms about things like mastitis. That's a really handy thing to have on hand for us if we're trying to add in some other thing besides our usual recommendations of stuff like ambrotose and drinking aloe juice and staying hydrated, massage, and getting that lymphatic going. There's a lot of other things that we can do, but that nature doesn't like to vacuum very much. So being able to put in the really solid probiotics is something that's really handy for us to do. So yeah, the kinds of probiotics that you take do make a difference. Numbers themselves aren't as significant as the reasons why for each little member of your party, what their special skill set is. I've seen a lot of probiotics in the market that are super loaded with like 50 billion colony forming units. You think it's super awesome, and you read it, and it's mostly yeast species. I can think of a couple right off the top of my head that do that. I've also seen a very well-known company that has told pediatricians that, oh, this is probiotics, and what it is 100 million colony forming units of one species. So basically 1% of what somebody would actually need in order to have a baby have a good reaction to probiotics. And these parents throw up their hands and say, listen, I spent all this money on these probiotics and they don't work. And I go, well, for the same price, how about we give you about 100 times more? What do you think of that? And they're so amazed at how much better these probiotics work. So yeah, I'm not endorsed by Claire Labs or SFI, their parent company. I've just been a very, very happy clinician for a long time with them. And so I always like to be able to help people understand the reasons why we carry the things that we carry. And that's a topic near and dear to my heart because I've had to go through it many times with kids, not only I take care of, but in my own household too. So if you have questions about things like this, remember, you can always drop them in the comments. Leave them here. We do our Instagram TV, we do our Facebook Lives, and also stream on YouTube. I look forward to seeing you guys on the next One Belly Wednesday. Until then, I hope you all take great care.